April 21, 1944, marked the day when Sergeant James MacDonald of the 2nd Armored Division first laid eyes on what his crew would later call the Devil's Own Machine. The morning mist clung to the Norman countryside like wet wool, and somewhere beyond the tangled hedgerows, the distinctive growl of a German engine echoed through the valley. MacDonald's Sherman tank, nicknamed Iron Maiden, had been probing enemy positions near the town of Ellen when the radio crackled with frantic reports from reconnaissance units. A tiger had been spotted, immobilized but intact, sitting abandoned in a farmer's field 3 kilometers west of their position. The Tiger. I was already legendary among Allied tank crews, whispered about in mess halls, and feared on battlefields from North Africa to the Eastern Front. According to a report published by the United States Army Ordnance Department in late 1943, the Tiger represented everything American tankers had been told was impossible. Armor so thick that standard anti-tank rounds bounced off like pebbles, an 88mm gun that could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away, and a reputation for mechanical complexity that bordered on the mythical. MacDonald had lost 3 friends to tigers in the previous month alone. Now, intelligence wanted one captured for evaluation, and his unit had drawn the short straw. Captain William Harrison, the company commander, assembled the recovery team in a bombed-out barn that afternoon. "Gentlemen," he announced, spreading a mud-stained map across an overturned crate, "we've got ourselves a golden opportunity. Jerry abandoned a tiger about here." His finger jabbed at a circled location. "Air reconnaissance confirms it's still there. No visible damage. Probably ran out of fuel, or threw a track." The room erupted in nervous chatter. Lieutenant Robert Chen, a maintenance officer from the 3rd Armored Division, who'd been temporarily attached to their unit, studied the map with the intensity of a jeweler examining a rare diamond. Chen had engineering training from MIT before the war, and his technical knowledge made him invaluable for this kind of operation. The plan was deceptively simple: secure the perimeter, determine why the tank was abandoned, and if possible, tow it back to Allied lines for thorough examination. But nothing involving a tiger was ever simple. As MacDonald's crew prepared their equipment, Corporal Eddie Sullivan, the youngest member at just 19 years old, voiced what everyone was thinking. "Sarge, what if it's a trap? What if the Krauts are using it as bait?" MacDonald checked his Thompson submachine gun and met Sullivan's worried gaze. "Then we'll deal with it, Eddie. But intelligence says the German forces in this sector are in full retreat. They're abandoning everything they can't carry." By dusk, 3 Shermans and a recovery vehicle had positioned themselves around the field where the Tiger sat motionless, its long gun barrel drooping slightly toward the earth like a tired beast. Through his binoculars, MacDonald could see the distinctive Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste covering its hull, and the intricate overlapping road wheels that made the Tiger so recognizable. It looked enormous, predatory, and somehow wrong sitting there in a peaceful French pasture where cows had grazed just weeks before. April 22, 1944 dawned cold and gray as Lieutenant Chen's inspection team cautiously approached the abandoned Tiger. The engineering officer had insisted on being first to examine the tank, despite protests from infantry escorts who'd swept the area for mines and booby traps during the night. As reported in the Army's Technical Intelligence Bulletin No. 57, German forces had developed a disturbing habit of rigging abandoned vehicles with explosives, turning them into deadly traps for curious Allied soldiers. Chen knew the risks, but the opportunity to examine an intact Tiger was simply too valuable to pass up. The Tiger sat at a slight angle in the field, its right side lower than the left, and as Chen circled the massive vehicle, he began documenting everything in a leather-bound notebook. The tank measured 20 feet 9 inches long, not including the gun barrel, and stood nearly 10 feet tall. Its width exceeded 12 feet, making it substantially larger than any Sherman variant. The armor plates showed numerous scratches and gouges, evidence of combat, but no penetrating hits. What struck Chen most was the sheer thickness of the steel. The frontal armor appeared to be at least 4 inches thick, possibly more. His hands traced the welded seams, feeling the quality of German engineering beneath his fingers. Sergeant MacDonald joined him after the area was declared secure. Together they pried open the commander's hatch, which moved with surprising ease despite the tank's abandonment. The interior smell hit them immediately, a nauseating mixture of fuel, oil, sweat, and something else MacDonald couldn't quite identify. Chen descended into the turret first, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. What he found inside was a revelation. The Tiger's interior was spacious compared to a Sherman, with the crew positions clearly defined and surprisingly well organized. The gunner's station featured an advanced Turmzilfernrohr 9 optical sight, far superior to anything American tanks carried. The commander's position included a sophisticated observation system with multiple periscopes, but it was the engine compartment that told the real story. After 20 minutes of inspection, Chen emerged from the tank with grease on his hands and excitement in his voice. "It's the fuel system," he announced to the assembled officers. "Look here, the fuel gauge reads nearly empty. I found documentation in the crew compartment, left behind in their hasty retreat." He held up a worn logbook, its pages filled with Germanic script. "If I'm reading this correctly, they were tracking fuel consumption meticulously. The last entry mentions they were trying to reach a supply depot approximately 40 kilometers away, but didn't make it." Captain Harrison examined the logbook, though he couldn't read German. "What's it say about fuel consumption?" Chen flipped through pages, his finger tracing columns of numbers. "This is extraordinary, sir. Based on their logs, this Tiger was consuming fuel at a rate that gave it approximately 120 miles maximum range on a full tank. That's on roads, under ideal conditions. Cross-country, through rough terrain, it's significantly worse, maybe half that distance." The assembled officers exchanged glances. MacDonald let out a low whistle. 120 miles? Our Shermans can go nearly twice that distance." The logbook revealed more troubling details about the Tiger's operational reality. According to documentation studied by Chen throughout that morning, as referenced in later technical reports compiled by the Aberdeen Proving Ground, the Maybach HL 230 P45 engine consumed approximately 500 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers of travel. This meant the Tiger's 700-liter fuel capacity was depleted with shocking rapidity. The crew had logged constant concerns about fuel availability, noting multiple instances where combat operations had to be curtailed because reaching the battlefield would leave insufficient fuel for withdrawal. The German crew had abandoned more than just their tank in that field. Inside, Chen's team discovered personal effects, letters from home, photographs of families, a harmonica, and half-eaten rations. These items painted a picture of the men who had operated this fearsome machine. Young soldiers probably not much different from the Americans now examining their abandoned war machine. April 23, 1944, brought a team of specialized engineers from the Ordnance Department to examine the captured Tiger more thoroughly. Major Thomas Aldridge, a pre-war automotive engineer from Detroit, led this team. He'd worked for Ford before joining the Army and had a reputation for understanding mechanical systems with almost intuitive clarity. As he climbed into the Tiger's engine bay, his experienced eye immediately recognized both the brilliance and the fundamental problems with German tank design philosophy. The Maybach engine that powered the Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering in many respects. 12 cylinders arranged in a V configuration, producing approximately 700 horsepower, it represented some of the finest engine manufacturing in the world. Major Aldridge spent 3 hours examining every component, making detailed sketches and measurements. "Gentlemen," he finally announced to the assembled technical staff, "this engine is simultaneously the best and worst thing about this tank. It's incredibly powerful, beautifully manufactured, and completely impractical for sustained warfare." His assessment would later be included in official reports that shaped American understanding of German armor doctrine. The fuel consumption issue went beyond simple inefficiency. Lieutenant Chen, working alongside Aldridge, discovered that the Tiger's designers had made critical compromises in pursuit of battlefield superiority. The tank weighed 56 tons fully loaded, nearly double the weight of a Sherman. Moving this massive vehicle required enormous power, and power demanded fuel. The Maybach engine, while impressive, simply couldn't overcome the basic physics of moving such tremendous weight with any degree of efficiency. According to technical analyses later published in Ordnance Department Bulletin No. 43 in June of 1944, the power-to-weight ratio created a situation where the Tiger consumed fuel at rates that made strategic mobility nearly impossible. Sergeant MacDonald watched the technical team work throughout the day, fascinated by their discoveries. Corporal Sullivan, ever curious despite his youth, asked the question that had been bothering everyone. "Sir, if the Tiger is so powerful, why'd the Germans design it with such a short range?" Major Aldridge wiped grease from his hands and considered the question carefully. "It's about doctrine, son. The Germans designed the Tiger for a different kind of war than what they're actually fighting. This tank was meant for relatively short defensive operations or carefully planned offensives with extensive logistical support. They imagined scenarios where supply lines could be maintained, where fuel trucks would always be nearby. The reality of the war in Europe had proven dramatically different from German planning assumptions. As Allied forces controlled the skies and interdicted supply convoys, German armored units found themselves increasingly immobilized, not by enemy action, but by empty fuel tanks. The Tiger's impressive combat capabilities became largely theoretical if it couldn't reach the battlefield or had to withdraw prematurely to preserve fuel for retreat. Captain Harrison reviewed the technical findings with growing understanding. "So we're looking at a weapon system that's tactically superior but strategically flawed?" Aldridge nodded. "Exactly. In a head-to-head engagement, a Tiger will destroy a Sherman 9 times out of 10. But if the Tiger can't get to the fight, or has to abandon positions because it's out of fuel, that superiority doesn't matter." The inspection team discovered additional fuel-related problems as they continued their examination. The Tiger's fuel system included multiple tanks distributed throughout the hull, a design meant to reduce fire risk, but which actually complicated fuel management. The crew had to manually balance fuel consumption between tanks to maintain the vehicle's weight distribution. This added another layer of complexity to an already demanding crew workload. Furthermore, the fuel pumps were intricate devices that required careful maintenance and were prone to failure if contaminated fuel entered the system. By evening, Major Aldridge had compiled a comprehensive report on the Tiger's fuel consumption characteristics. His calculations, based on the German crew's logbook and physical inspection of the vehicle, painted a stark picture. Under combat conditions, operating cross-country with frequent acceleration and direction changes, the Tiger consumed fuel at a rate that provided perhaps 60 to 70 miles of operational range. For comparison, a Sherman tank under similar conditions could travel 120 miles before refueling. This meant German Tiger units required twice the logistical support of equivalent American armored formations. April 24, 1944, introduced an unexpected dimension to the Tiger investigation, when intelligence officers brought news that 3 members of the tank's crew had been captured 2 days earlier, trying to reach German lines on foot. Colonel Richard Morrison, the division's chief intelligence officer, arranged for Lieutenant Chen and Sergeant MacDonald to observe interrogations, believing their technical knowledge might elicit useful information. The prisoners were brought to a farmhouse converted into a temporary interrogation facility, where they sat under guard, exhausted and defeated. The tank commander, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, was 32 years old and had fought in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, before being transferred to the Western Theater. According to the interrogation records later filed with the 7th Army Intelligence Summary for April 1944, Weber initially refused to discuss technical details of his vehicle. However, when confronted with the fact that his Tiger had been captured intact, his resistance crumbled. "You have found the beast, then?" he asked in surprisingly good English. "And you have discovered its hunger." His bitter smile suggested a man who had wrestled with this problem for months. Through careful questioning, Colonel Morrison extracted a detailed account of the Tiger's final hours. Weber explained that his unit, Schwerpanzerabteilung 503, had been operating in Normandy for 6 weeks, conducting defensive operations against advancing American forces. The battalion had started with 14 Tigers, but mechanical problems and fuel shortages had reduced operational strength to just 7 vehicles by mid-April. "Every mission became a calculation," Weber admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "Could we reach the objective? Would there be fuel for withdrawal? How much combat time could we sustain before we must retreat to preserve enough fuel to escape?" The German commander's account revealed the psychological toll of operating a fuel-starved superweapon. On April 19th, Weber's Tiger had been ordered to reinforce a defensive position 15 miles away. The battalion's supply officer had promised fuel trucks would meet them at the destination, but those trucks never arrived, destroyed by Allied fighter bombers before they could reach the rendezvous point. Weber's tank had consumed nearly all its fuel reaching the position, leaving just enough for perhaps 20 miles of travel. When orders came to withdraw that evening as American forces threatened to envelop the position, Weber faced an impossible choice: attempt to reach friendly lines and risk running out of fuel in open country, or preserve his crew by abandoning the Tiger in a concealed location. Lieutenant Chen listened intently as Weber described the decision-making process. "We had perhaps 130 kilometers worth of fuel remaining," the German officer explained, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. The nearest German fuel depot was over 50 kilometers distant, across terrain where American aircraft controlled the skies. "We could not travel by road. Your planes would spot us immediately. Cross-country, through the hedgerows and fields, our fuel consumption increases dramatically. I calculated we might reach perhaps 30 kilometers before the tank became immobile." He paused, meeting Chen's eyes. "A dead Tiger is worth nothing. A Tiger that runs out of fuel in enemy territory is worse than nothing. It is a gift to your intelligence services." The gunner, Unteroffizier Hans Richter, provided additional details about daily operations with the Tiger. He was 24 years old, a veteran of 2 years of Eastern Front combat before being assigned to the Western Theater. "Herr Lieutenant," he addressed Chen formally, "you must understand that fuel dominated every aspect of our existence. Not the enemy, not tactics, not even survival. Fuel. Every morning the first question was, how much fuel? Every evening, the last question was how much fuel remains." His testimony, recorded in Morrison's intelligence notes, revealed that Tiger crews had developed elaborate systems for conserving fuel, including rolling down slopes with engines off, planning routes that minimized unnecessary movement, and sometimes refusing combat orders when fuel situations were critical. The driver, Obergefreiter Martin Becker, was the youngest at 20 years old. His experience was particularly illuminating for the American technical team. Becker described the constant anxiety of operating a vehicle that consumed fuel faster than combat consumed ammunition. "I learned to drive very smoothly," he explained, "because harsh acceleration or sudden braking wasted precious fuel. But in combat, smooth driving is often impossible. When enemy tanks appear, when artillery begins falling, you must move violently, quickly. Every evasive maneuver, every high-speed retreat, every aggressive advance, all drink fuel like a thirsty giant." He demonstrated with hand gestures how he'd tried to balance survival with fuel conservation, a calculus no driver should have to make. As the interrogations concluded, Weber offered a final observation that resonated deeply with everyone present. "Your Sherman is not as powerful as our Tiger, this is true. But I would rather command 10 Shermans than 2 Tigers. The Sherman can reach the battlefield, can maneuver during combat, can withdraw and return tomorrow. The Tiger is like a powerful fortress that cannot move from where it sits. What good is the thickest armor and longest gun if you cannot bring them to where the enemy fights?" April 25, 1944. Witnessed a revealing experiment that would influence American armor doctrine for years to come. Major Aldridge proposed actually operating the captured Tiger to verify the fuel consumption figures derived from German logs and calculations. After ensuring the tank was mechanically sound and safe to operate, a mixed crew of American tankers and mechanics prepared to take the beast for a test drive. Captain Harrison authorized the experiment but insisted on strict safety protocols. The last thing anyone wanted was to lose personnel testing an enemy vehicle. Sergeant McDonald volunteered to serve as commander for the test, despite never having operated anything larger than a Sherman. The Tiger's controls were labeled in German, requiring Lieutenant Chen to create quick translation notes for the crew. At precisely 1000 hours with fuel tanks filled to capacity, a process that required 700 liters and 3 fuel trucks to accomplish, the Maybach engine roared to life. The sound was distinctive, deeper and more powerful than any American tank engine McDonald had experienced. Through the commander's periscope, He watched the surrounding trees tremble slightly from the vibration. The test plan called for a 20-mile circuit through Norman countryside, alternating between road travel and cross-country movement, with careful measurements of fuel consumption at each stage. A Sherman tank with precisely measured fuel load would follow the same route immediately afterward for direct comparison. Corporal Sullivan, operating as radio operator and assistant, maintained constant communication with the observation team following in jeeps. As the Tiger lurched forward, its sheer mass became immediately apparent. Whereas Sherman responded crisply to control inputs, the Tiger moved with ponderous deliberation, like waking a sleeping giant. The first leg covered 8 miles of relatively smooth dirt road. McDonald carefully observed the fuel gauge, which showed alarmingly rapid movement. "Chen, confirm these readings," he called over the intercom. The lieutenant, positioned in the gunner's seat where he could monitor multiple instruments, verified the commander's observations. "We've consumed approximately 150 liters in 8 miles, Sergeant. That's roughly 19 liters per mile on relatively easy terrain." The Sherman following them, covering identical distance, consumed less than half that amount. According to the detailed report later published by the Aberdeen Proving Ground in August 1944, this represented one of the most comprehensive comparative fuel consumption studies conducted during the war. The cross-country portion of the test proved even more revealing. As the Tiger climbed a modest slope, its engine note changed, rising in pitch and intensity. The fuel gauge needle seemed to move visibly downward. 5 miles of rough terrain consumed over 200 liters of fuel. McDonald, increasingly impressed by the vehicle's power but appalled by its thirst, radioed his observations back to command. "This thing drinks fuel like it's trying to empty the entire Atlantic Ocean, sir. We're burning through our load at a rate that'll leave us dry before we complete the circuit." Major Aldridge, monitoring from a following vehicle, instructed them to continue to complete the comparative data set. By the time the Tiger returned to its starting point, having covered exactly 20 miles of mixed terrain, the fuel gauges showed only about 250 liters remaining from the original 700-liter capacity. Lieutenant Chen's calculations confirmed the sobering reality. The Tiger had achieved approximately 15 miles per 100 liters under test conditions, which translated to roughly 105 miles maximum range with full tanks. Under combat conditions with the stress of acceleration, deceleration, and high-speed maneuvering, this range would decrease to perhaps 70 or 80 miles. The following Sherman, covering the identical route, consumed approximately 240 liters from its 660-liter capacity, achieving more than double the fuel efficiency. Captain Harrison reviewed the data with Major Aldridge and Lieutenant Chen that afternoon, and the implications were staggering. "Gentlemen," Harrison observed, "this means a Tiger battalion requires more than twice the fuel logistics of a comparable Sherman battalion, despite having fewer tanks. And those logistics must somehow reach the front lines through territory, where we control the air." Aldridge nodded grimly. "Now multiply that by every Tiger unit in the German army. They're literally burning through their strategic fuel reserves faster than their refineries, and conquered territories can replace it." The experiment yielded additional insights beyond pure consumption numbers. The American crew noted that operating the Tiger required constant attention to engine temperatures, oil pressure, and fuel distribution. The German engineers had created a powerful machine, but one that demanded experienced, technically proficient crews. A single mistake, overheating the engine, failing to monitor oil levels, unbalanced fuel consumption between tanks, could result in catastrophic mechanical failure far from support. As Sullivan observed after climbing out of the Tiger, exhausted despite the relatively short drive, "I feel like I just fought a battle with the tank itself, and the tank won." April 26, 1944 marked the arrival of Colonel George Patterson from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, sent specifically to review findings from the Tiger capture. Patterson brought with him broader intelligence about German fuel situations gathered from multiple sources across the European theater. In a meeting held at division headquarters, he shared information that placed the Tiger's fuel consumption in devastating strategic context. "Gentlemen," he began, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the briefing table, "what you've discovered here with this single Tiger reflects a crisis that's crippling the entire German war machine. According to classified intelligence summaries that Patterson shared with the assembled officers, German fuel production had been in steady decline since early 1944. Allied strategic bombing had targeted synthetic fuel plants throughout Germany and occupied territories, systematically destroying the Reich's capacity to produce petroleum products. Patterson cited specific figures from intelligence estimates. German fuel production had dropped from approximately 1 million tons per month in late 1943 to approximately 700,000 tons by April 1944, with projections indicating further decline. The Germans are facing a fundamental resource crisis, Patterson explained. They don't have enough fuel to sustain their military operations, particularly their armored forces. Lieutenant Chen connected this strategic picture to the tactical reality they'd observed. So the Tiger's poor fuel efficiency isn't just a design flaw, it's a strategic liability that compounds Germany's fuel crisis. Patterson nodded approvingly. Exactly right, Lieutenant. Every Tiger on the battlefield accelerates German fuel depletion. Consider the mathematics. If a Tiger consumes fuel at twice the rate of your Sherman, but can only operate half the distance before refueling, the Germans need approximately 4 times the fuel logistics to achieve comparable operational range. But they don't have 4 times the logistics. They have significantly less fuel available than we do. The intelligence officer produced additional documents showing German fuel allocation priorities. Armored units received preference over most other formations, but even they faced severe rationing. We've interrogated numerous German prisoners over recent months, Patterson continued, and a consistent theme emerges. Fuel shortages constrain every operation. Tank units receive orders to advance, but fuel deliveries arrive late or not at all. Defensive positions must be abandoned, not because of enemy pressure, but because defending units lack fuel to reposition or withdraw. We've documented multiple instances of German armor being destroyed or abandoned, purely due to fuel exhaustion. Sergeant MacDonald, listening intently to the briefing, raised a question that had been troubling him. Sir, if the fuel situation is this desperate, why are the Germans still producing Tigers? Why not manufacture lighter tanks that consume less fuel? Patterson's response illuminated the complex interaction between military doctrine, industrial capacity, and strategic reality. The Germans are trapped by their own earlier decisions, Sergeant. Their tank factories were specifically tooled for Tiger and Panther production. Converting those factories to produce lighter vehicles would require months of retooling, during which production would halt entirely. They can't afford that pause. Additionally, German doctrine emphasizes quality over quantity. Fewer superior tanks, rather than more inferior ones. That doctrine worked when they had adequate fuel, but now it's become a strategic albatross. Major Aldridge contributed his perspective on the industrial aspects. There's also the matter of momentum, Colonel. The German military-industrial complex represents a vast network of suppliers, subcontractors, and assembly facilities. The Tiger alone requires components from hundreds of sources. Changing production means disrupting that entire network. In wartime, institutional momentum often overrides rational adaptation. His observation, drawn from pre-war experience in American automotive manufacturing, highlighted how even clearly flawed systems resist change when embedded in complex organizations. The discussion turned to offensive implications for Allied operations. Captain Harrison posed the critical question: how do we exploit this weakness, Colonel? How do we turn German fuel poverty into our advantage? Patterson's answer revealed planning that extended far beyond tactical considerations. Air interdiction, Captain. We're intensifying strategic bombing of fuel production and transportation infrastructure. Every synthetic fuel plant we destroy, every fuel convoy we intercept, every rail line we cut, these actions directly impact German operational capability. Additionally, our tactical doctrine emphasizes mobility and sustained operations. We push German forces into constant movement, accelerating their fuel consumption. Lieutenant Chen recognized another dimension to the strategic picture. The Soviets are probably experiencing similar advantages on the Eastern Front, aren't they, sir? Patterson confirmed this assessment. Intelligence suggests German forces in the East are even more severely fuel-constrained than those here in the West. The Soviets are advancing rapidly, forcing German units into exactly the kind of mobile warfare that maximizes fuel consumption. German armored reserves intended for counterattacks often arrive at jump-off points with insufficient fuel to execute their missions. This coordination between Eastern and Western fronts, even if not directly planned, created compounding pressure on German fuel resources. The meeting concluded with Patterson emphasizing the importance of the captured Tiger for understanding enemy capabilities and limitations. This vehicle you've captured and analyzed represents more than technical intelligence, gentlemen. It's a window into German strategic thinking, their industrial capabilities, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. The data you've gathered here will be distributed throughout Allied commands, shaping our understanding of how to fight and defeat German armor. The Tiger's fuel consumption isn't just a technical specification, it's a strategic weakness we can exploit across the entire theater of operations. April 27, 1944 brought additional context as historians and military analysts arrived to study the captured Tiger within the broader framework of World War II mechanized warfare. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a civilian analyst with the War Department, who held a doctorate in engineering from Carnegie Mellon, led this team. Her expertise in comparative industrial production made her particularly valuable for understanding why German armor suffered from such critical design limitations. As she examined the Tiger thoroughly, taking extensive notes and measurements, she provided fascinating insights into the intersection of technology, industry, and strategic decision-making. Dr. Sullivan explained that the Tiger's fuel consumption represented just one symptom of a larger philosophical approach to warfare that prioritized individual weapon performance over systemic effectiveness. The Germans have consistently emphasized technical superiority at the platform level, she lectured to the assembled officers that morning. They design weapons that are individually superior to Allied equivalents: better armor, bigger guns, more sophisticated optics. But they consistently undervalue logistical sustainability and production scalability. Her analysis, later incorporated into War Department training materials, helped explain why German armor, despite technical excellence, was losing the war. The comparison with American design philosophy proved illuminating. Lieutenant Chen, fascinated by Dr. Sullivan's perspective, engaged her in detailed discussion about industrial constraints. "Our Sherman isn't as powerful as the Tiger in direct combat," Chen observed, "but we're producing them in numbers the Germans can't match. We've built over 40,000 Shermans, while German Tiger production numbers in the hundreds." Sullivan nodded vigorously. "Exactly right, Lieutenant. The Sherman represents a fundamentally different design philosophy: adequate performance, high reliability, excellent production scalability, and sustainable logistics. The Sherman gets its crews to the battle, operates reliably under harsh conditions, and when destroyed, is quickly replaced." Dr. Sullivan shared data from industrial production studies that quantified the resource investment differences between the two tanks. According to research compiled by the War Production Board and referenced in her analysis, a single Tiger required approximately 300,000 man-hours to manufacture, while a Sherman required approximately 45,000 man-hours. The Tiger consumed rare materials including molybdenum, tungsten, and high-grade steel alloys that were increasingly scarce in Germany. The Sherman used more common materials and employed manufacturing techniques adapted from civilian automotive production, allowing rapid scaling of output. The fuel consumption issue connected directly to these industrial realities. Major Aldridge, working alongside Dr. Sullivan, realized that the Tiger's thirst for fuel reflected broader resource allocation problems in the German war economy. "They're fighting a multi-front war with limited resources," he observed, "yet they're producing vehicles that consume those resources at unsustainable rates. It's strategically incoherent." Sullivan agreed. "The Germans are trapped in what economists call a sunk cost fallacy. They've invested heavily in this approach to armor warfare: the factories, the supply chains, the training systems, and they can't pivot to more sustainable designs without sacrificing short-term capability, which they also can't afford." Sergeant MacDonald, listening to these discussions, found himself developing a more nuanced understanding of warfare beyond the tactical level. He asked Dr. Sullivan a question that revealed the intellectual growth these analysis sessions had prompted. "Ma'am, You're suggesting that wars aren't won just by having the best individual weapons, but by having adequate weapons in sustainable numbers with reliable logistics? Sullivan smiled, pleased by the insight. Precisely, Sergeant. The Tiger is a magnificent weapon in isolation. But warfare isn't conducted in isolation. It's a sustained enterprise requiring consistent supply, replacement of losses, and operational sustainability. The Sherman might lose most individual engagements with a Tiger, but it wins the campaign by being present in overwhelming numbers, operating far from supply bases, and continuing to fight after other vehicles would have stopped. The afternoon session focused on captured German documents that provided additional context about Tiger operations. Captain Harrison had obtained after-action reports from several German armored units through intelligence channels, and these documents painted a sobering picture of operational reality. One report from Schwerpanzerabteilung 502, dated March 19, 1944, described a planned offensive involving 12 Tigers that had to be cancelled because only 7 tanks had adequate fuel to reach the start line, and those 7 lacked sufficient fuel reserves to conduct operations and withdraw safely. Another report detailed a defensive action where Tigers successfully destroyed numerous Allied tanks, but had to be abandoned during subsequent withdrawal due to fuel exhaustion. Dr. Sullivan synthesized these various information streams into a comprehensive analysis. What we're observing, she concluded in her evening briefing, is the collision between German military excellence and strategic resource constraints. The Wehrmacht produces technically sophisticated weapons but cannot sustain them operationally. This Tiger you've captured perfectly exemplifies the contradiction, a tank so powerful it can dominate any battlefield engagement it reaches, yet so fuel-hungry it often cannot reach the battlefield at all, and cannot remain there long even when it arrives. This isn't a failure of German engineering, which is exceptional. It's a failure of strategic alignment between weapon design and resource availability. April 28, 1944 concluded the initial intensive study of the captured Tiger, as the tank was prepared for transport to the United States for even more detailed examination at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Sergeant MacDonald stood in the muddy field one final time, watching as engineers prepared the massive vehicle for loading onto a specialized transport. Lieutenant Chen joined him, both men contemplating what they'd learned over the past week. "You know what strikes me most?" Chen mused. "This tank represents everything that's wrong with fighting a war you can't afford to fight. It's too expensive, too complicated, too fuel-hungry, but it's also magnificent in a way. The Germans built themselves a masterpiece they couldn't sustain." The captured Tiger would indeed travel to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, arriving in June 1944. There, American engineers conducted even more exhaustive testing, documenting every aspect of the vehicle's performance. According to the comprehensive technical report published by Aberdeen on September 15, 1944, the Tiger's fuel consumption under various conditions was measured precisely. 15.7 gallons per mile on roads, 32.4 gallons per mile cross-country, and an astounding 45 gallons per mile during combat maneuvers. These figures confirmed the field observations made by MacDonald's unit. The Tiger consumed fuel at rates that made sustained operations impossible without extensive logistical support. The broader implications of the Tiger's capture extended far beyond technical specifications. American armor doctrine evolved partly based on lessons learned from studying German tank design. Rather than pursuing matching increases in tank size and firepower, which would have imposed similar logistical penalties, American designers focused on incremental improvements to the Sherman, developing variants with better guns and armor, while maintaining the fundamental reliability and logistical sustainability that gave Allied armor its strategic advantage. The philosophy became clear: build tanks that your logistics can actually support, not tanks that exist primarily in theory. Captain Harrison wrote in his after-action report, filed with 2nd Armored Division headquarters on April 30, 1944, that the captured Tiger teaches us that technological superiority, without logistical sustainability, represents a hollow achievement. The enemy has built a weapon that cannot be sustained in the field, creating a self-defeating cycle where their most powerful weapons become unavailable exactly when most needed. His observations influenced training materials distributed throughout American armored forces, helping crews understand that their Sherman's reliability and operational range represented genuine advantages, not merely consolation for inferior combat performance. Dr. Margaret Sullivan's comprehensive analysis became required reading at military colleges after the war. Her report, titled Strategic Implications of Platform-Level Technical Superiority in Resource-Constrained Conflicts, examined how German pursuit of weapons excellence contributed to their defeat. She argued that the Tiger exemplified a broader pattern in German military thinking, prioritizing individual weapon performance over systematic considerations of production capacity, resource availability, and logistical sustainability. Her work influenced post-war American defense planning, reinforcing the importance of aligning weapon system requirements with realistic resource constraints. For the German crew of the abandoned Tiger, the war ended differently for each man. Hauptmann Klaus Weber survived captivity and returned to Germany after the war, eventually becoming an engineer in the automotive industry. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, but in a 1972 interview with a military history publication, he reflected on the Tiger's fundamental problem. "We built a beautiful, powerful machine that our army could not sustain. It was like giving a starving man a feast that required more energy to eat than it provided. The Tiger was our feast, impressive to behold but ultimately unable to nourish the forces that deployed it." Unteroffizier Hans Richter and Obergefreiter Martin Becker also survived the war, returning to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. Both men later expressed similar sentiments about their time in Tigers, pride in the machine's capabilities mixed with frustration at its limitations. Becker, in a 1985 letter to a military museum, wrote, "We called our Tiger the Hungry Beast, and the name fit perfectly. It was powerful, feared, magnificent, and always hungry for fuel we did not have. I spent more time worrying about fuel gauges than enemy tanks." The Tiger II that Sergeant MacDonald's unit captured in that Norman field in April 1944 still exists today, one of only 7 surviving Tiger Y tanks in the world. It resides at the United States Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where visitors can observe the massive vehicle and contemplate the lessons it represents. A plaque beside the display notes the tank's fuel consumption characteristics, explaining to modern observers how logistical constraints limited even the most powerful weapons. The Tiger stands as a monument not to German defeat specifically, but to the universal military principle that capability without sustainability creates illusion rather than actual power. The story of this particular Tiger, abandoned in a field because its crew lacked fuel to continue, captured by American forces who couldn't believe such a powerful weapon suffered from such crippling limitations, became a teaching tool for generations of military planners. At the United States Military Academy at West Point, instructors used the Tiger's fuel consumption data in logistics courses, demonstrating how operational art requires balancing combat effectiveness with sustainable support. The lesson resonated particularly during the Cold War, when American defense planners faced their own temptations to pursue technological superiority without adequate consideration of logistical implications. Lieutenant Chen's detailed technical notes from the Tiger examination became part of his military personnel file, leading to his assignment to the Ordnance Department after the European campaign concluded. He spent the remainder of his career studying the intersection of engineering and military effectiveness, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1968. In his farewell address at the Ordnance School, Chen reflected on that week in Normandy. "The Tiger taught me that wars are won not by the best weapons, but by adequate weapons employed in sustainable numbers. That principle guided my entire career, and it remains as true today as it was in 1944. Sergeant James MacDonald continued serving with the 2nd Armored Division through the end of the European War, participating in the drive across France and into Germany. He survived the war and returned to his pre-war occupation as a mechanic in Pennsylvania, though he never forgot his week examining the Tiger. In a 1991 interview for a Veterans History Project, MacDonald, then 70 years old, recalled, "That German tank was the most impressive piece of machinery I'd ever seen. Beautiful engineering, powerful beyond belief. but it was designed for a different war than the one being fought. The Germans imagined short, decisive campaigns, where logistics could be managed carefully. Instead, they got a long, grinding struggle where fuel became more precious than ammunition. That Tiger sitting abandoned in the field, out of fuel just miles from supply. That image told you everything about why Germany was losing. The strategic fuel crisis that doomed the Tiger and other German armored vehicles only worsened as 1944 progressed. Allied bombing intensified throughout the summer, systematically destroying synthetic fuel production facilities across Germany and occupied territories. By August 1944, German fuel production had collapsed to approximately 30% of 1943 levels. Panzer divisions reported to High Command that their Tigers and Panthers sat immobilized, not from battle damage but from empty fuel tanks. Even when Germany mounted its last great offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, fuel shortages critically constrained operations. German planners counted on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain their advance, a desperate expedient that ultimately failed. The contrast with Allied logistics became even starker as the war progressed. American and British forces constructed elaborate fuel supply systems, including the famous Pluto pipeline under the English Channel, capable of delivering millions of gallons of fuel to advancing armies. The famous Red Ball Express truck convoys hauled thousands of tons of supplies daily, including the fuel that kept Sherman tanks moving forward. While German Tigers sat abandoned beside roads throughout France and Germany, victims of fuel starvation, Allied armor continued advancing, supplied by logistics networks that prioritize sustainability over individual platform performance. Post-war analysis by military historians consistently identified German fuel poverty as a decisive factor in Allied victory. Studies published in the 1950s and 60s by the United States Army Center of Military History documented how German operational planning was increasingly constrained by fuel availability from 1943 onward. The Tiger Vorwärts, along with its successor the Tiger II and the Panther medium tank, represented the culmination of German armored design philosophy: powerful, sophisticated, technically impressive, and ultimately unsustainable given Germany's strategic resource situation. The lessons from the captured Tiger influenced not just American military thinking, but international understanding of military logistics. NATO doctrine developed during the Cold War emphasized the importance of sustainable logistics chains and realistic assessment of fuel consumption in operational planning. Soviet military theorists, studying the same World War II examples, reached similar conclusions. Their tank designs prioritized fuel efficiency and operational range alongside combat capability, recognizing that immobilized armor serves no military purpose regardless of its theoretical firepower. Modern military vehicles still grapple with the same fundamental tensions between performance and sustainability that the Tiger exemplified. Contemporary main battle tanks like the American M1 Abrams consume fuel at rates that would shock World War II tankers, approximately 300 gallons to travel 100 miles, necessitating elaborate fuel logistics for sustained operations. However, modern fuel distribution systems, including aerial refueling of logistics aircraft and forward area refueling equipment, provide capabilities that make such consumption manageable in ways unavailable to German forces in 1944. The difference lies not in avoiding fuel consumption, but in building military systems that can actually sustain that consumption operationally. The specific Tiger I captured by Sergeant MacDonald's unit in April 1944 traveled a long journey from that muddy Norman field to its final resting place in Maryland. After extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, it was placed in storage until the Ordnance Museum opened to the public in 1963. Restoration work in the 1990s ensured the vehicle's preservation for future generations. Today, thousands of visitors annually examine the massive tank, reading the interpretive materials that explain not just how the Tiger worked, but why it ultimately failed to achieve its strategic purpose. The human stories behind that particular Tiger, Klaus Weber making the difficult decision to abandon his command rather than see his crew die in a futile attempt to reach German lines, James MacDonald risking booby traps to examine an enemy vehicle, Robert Chen translating German logbooks in a muddy field. the anonymous German crew members whose letters home were found inside the tank. These individual experiences illustrated the larger narrative of World War II. Wars are fought by individual human beings making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances, but the outcomes are determined by larger forces: industrial capacity, resource availability, strategic planning, and the alignment between tactical capabilities and operational sustainability. In the end, the Tiger I that American tankers captured in Normandy, and couldn't believe only achieved 120 miles per tank of fuel, became far more valuable as an intelligence asset and teaching tool than it ever was as a combat vehicle. Its capture, examination, and analysis contributed to Allied understanding of German weaknesses, influenced American armor doctrine, and provided lessons that remained relevant decades after the war's conclusion. The Tiger's magnificent engineering and crippling fuel consumption together told a story about the nature of modern warfare. That technological excellence divorced from realistic resource constraints creates weapons that impress observers but fail operators. That sustainability often matters more than superiority, and that the most powerful weapon is useless if it cannot reach the battlefield or remain there long enough to influence the outcome. The legacy of that abandoned Tiger in a Norman field thus extends far beyond its individual combat record. It represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing technological perfection without considering logistical reality, a lesson as relevant to modern defense planning as it was in 1944. For the men who captured, examined, and studied it, MacDonald, Chen, Harrison, Aldridge, and dozens of others, that week in late April 1944 provided insights that shaped their understanding of warfare for the rest of their lives. The Tiger taught them that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, supply depots, and fuel dumps, and that the relationship between combat power and logistical sustainability determines victory as surely as tactical skill or strategic vision.